California, Medina Miranda is a rising junior, double majoring in American Studies and English Literature. Here at Northwestern, Medina is a Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellow, which thank you to Stephanie and President's Office for always partnering with us in this program. Under the Shabraha Center of Historical Studies and previously held an undergraduate research assistantship. Her research interests include the intersections of race and ethnicity, labor, and the environment in American history and literature. Following her undergraduate studies, she hopes to pursue a PhD in American Studies, becoming a passionate researcher and educator. Please help me in welcoming our last presenter, Medina Miranda.
Thank you so much, Dr. B. Hi everyone, my name is Medina Miranda, and my project is called The Color of Dust. Covers slow violence, racialization, and environmental disaster in 1930s American literature. So, when you think of dust, you might think of antique furniture or cobwebs. But I want to take you back to the 1930s. In America, this was a decade defined by economic collapse, racial tension, and of course, dust. This was also a time when the US government, through FDR, supported artists and writers through New Deal programs. Two of these included Sonora Babb and Muriel Rukeyser, both white female writers with journalism backgrounds. Within this historical context, two dust disasters began to accumulate, and Babb and Rukeyser were on it. In 1939, Sonora Babb wrote her novel, Whose Names Are Unknown, about the Dust Bowl, a time when dust storms destroyed farms and displaced hundreds of thousands from states like Oklahoma. Many of them suffered from dust pneumonia, characterized by intense coughing and lung damage. These farmers migrated west to California in search of work, but they were still met with hostility and discrimination, mostly from other white Americans, due to class and regional prejudice. They were called Okies and other racial slurs, and were even seen as particles of dust themselves. So the stigma of dust followed the farmers across state lines. And in 1938, Muriel Rukeyser published The Book of the Dead, a series of poems about the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia a few years prior. In this disaster, thousands of mostly Black laborers, displaced by the Depression, migrated from southern states, also in search of work. But upon being sent to work in the tunnel, they were rarely given safety gear, despite the well-known health effects of occupational silicosis, a fatal lung disease. And over years, nearly 800 laborers, both Black and white, slowly died after inhaling silica dust. I compared their two works in a comparative literary analysis for these reasons. For one, they've rarely been studied together, but more importantly, they both ask how environmental dust can affect the identities of those that it covers. After establishing this historical context in my project, I further ground my argument by claiming that both works are examples of what scholar Rob Nixon calls slow violence. Nixon writes, "By slow violence, I mean a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all." Babb and Rukeyser don't just write about these environmental disasters. They show how these disasters first accumulate and then linger over time, both in individual bodies and larger systems of race and labor. So ultimately in my project, I claim that in these two works of literature, dust serves as a lens that reveals how environmental disaster exposes and shapes the racial and class identities of marginalized populations. And to do this, I found that these authors both use techniques that blur the boundaries of genre. As stated before, something that links these two authors is how they drew on their previous journalism work to enrich their literary texts. Babb, for example, grew up in Oklahoma and later worked for the Farm Security Administration during the Dust Bowl. She integrated her mother's diary entries into her novel and kept most of the original language describing the domestic effects of the dust storms. On the other hand, Rukeyser had previously covered many civil rights cases, the most notable of which being the Scottsboro Boys trial in 1931, when she was just 19. She incorporated a congressional hearing on the Hawks Nest Tunnel into the Book of the Dead, and some of the poems ended up including legal testimony from doctors, widows, and tunnel workers, which we'll get back to later. Some critics of Brookhiser have argued that this blend of sources makes her work feel unfocused or too broad, but in my paper, I argue that this collage technique in both of these texts is very intentional, and most importantly, it mirrors the nature of dust itself. The gradual layering of different genres creates a sense of slow accumulation, giving these works a serious power. In my analysis, I take it a step further. Each text can be read as a physical body, so the insertion of different genres mimics the way dust invades and sickens human bodies, just like the symptoms of dust pneumonia or silicosis. After this formal analysis, I turned to a close reading of two specific scenes, which I chose since they both involve dust and washing. I begin by examining children in Bab's work and how they believe that they can rise out of the conditions by cleaning off the dust after working in the fields. I call this the formation of moral whiteness, which is taken from critical race studies. I interpret this as Bab believing that dignity and hard work can restore or earn whiteness and ensure acceptance into California's schools, as shown here, and society. On the other hand, I turn to Brookhiser's poem of her text called George Robinson Blues. George Robinson was a black tunnel worker, and she took his testimony from that same hearing that I mentioned earlier. But in opposition to that moral whiteness that I read in Bab's text, I found that Brookhiser proposed a concept of lethal whiteness. George Robinson Blues shows that the suffocating white silica dust indiscriminately harms whoever it touches, both white and black. As this quote shows, the workers cannot wash the dust off their clothes or bodies, unlike Bab's children. Brookhiser implies that victims have become united across racial lines in death, and that whiteness, framed as dust, destroys bodies from the inside out. So, while both authors explore similar environmental effects, like illness, migration, and discrimination, the metaphor of dust acts differently in their works. For Bab, dust is an obstacle to achieving whiteness. But for Brookhiser, dust is whiteness. Dust is slow violence. And dust is not just a Depression-era problem. Since around 2021, the Great Salt Lake in Utah has been drying up due to excessive water usage. As a result, the lake bed is becoming exposed and is slowly releasing dust filled with heavy metals like lead and arsenic into the air. Experts warn that this will cause local cancer rates to spike. And very similarly to the 1930s dust disasters, these effects have started to fall across distinct racial and class lines. The 2024 study shown here found that Pacific Islander, Latino, and Black communities in Salt Lake City, as well as poor communities, are already more at risk of dust exposure. So we must pay attention to how this crisis is covered in the future, because slow violence is, well, slow. In conclusion, we can turn to Bab and Brookhiser's work to help us see that dust isn't always what's abandoned, antique, or left behind. I want to claim that their work forms a literature of dust, which positions this leftover residue at the forefront of the conversation. Most importantly, I want to show that literature of dust can be an active site for rethinking the intersections of race, labor, and environmental disaster, even 90 years later. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
This is really fascinating and so interesting and important. I think I'm wondering if you thought about the ways in which natural disaster is constructed, and so this is a little bit beyond the scope of what you're talking about, but sort of as a sociologist who thinks about environmental racism, I would say there's nothing at all natural about this. And I'm just wondering if you were also thinking about themes of sort of neglect and policy decisions that are creating the dust, and certainly in the modern times, but I wondered if you saw that in either of the texts that you read.
Yeah, I really did. That's what's really fascinating, is that the Hawks Nest disaster was also framed as an industrial disaster, but the Dust Bowl wasn't. That was more of an environmental. And I think it's very interesting that the industrial disaster fell on mostly Black victims, while the natural one happened to affect mostly white families and children. I think is a big thing that Bab wanted to focus on, like their innocence. So I think that focus on man-made disaster is really important. We're seeing that again with the Salt Lake City with excessive water usage. That's very intentional, and these policy decisions definitely led to this. I think that's something that definitely should be studied in future research. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, I think that your research is wonderful. And my question is that when you talk about policy decisions, because a lot of presentations to me circle back around to what the governmental policies are and how they fail to, in situations that where industry is looked at as the primary power, that the people suffer. And we're seeing that not only in Salt Lake City, but in the current situation that's happening in Tennessee and Elon Musk and his whatevers. So, where do you see, it's unfortunate that you see a future in your research because of this. And that's my question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think, the focus on industry, I think the industrial negligence that happened in both the disasters, as well as the current ones that you just brought up, is really unfortunate and really sad, but it just shows how deep, even in the congressional hearing that I mentioned, the industry hired doctors kept denying the real effects. So that's kind of what Root Kaiser's work hope to do, is to, expose the true stories of the victims through a more artistic way, a more literary way that could reach more people. So that's the importance of literature, art like this. It can help bring these not only the natural or environmental disasters, but the industrial, how tied up private industry and government were in these situations. So thank you.